everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Death in Cambodia, Life in America. It is Dorothy, your favorite host out of all your podcasters. I know I am. And we are back with another amazing guest. Anthropologist Professor Judy Ledgerwood is a cultural anthropologist studying the aftermath of violence and social relations after the Khmer Rouge. She currently serves as the director of the Center of Southeast Asian Studies and is taught at Royal University of Fine Arts, Faculty of Archaeology in Phnom Penh, and has many senior research fellowships from the Center of Khmer Studies. She has served on the board of National Cambodian Heritage Museum and the Killing Fields Memorial in Chicago, and has released countless publications and books on this topic. Professor Judy, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I mean, just looking at your resume, Professor, you have always seemed to have a passion for Asian studies. Graduated summa cum laude in 1982 with Asian studies. How did you know that you wanted to focus specifically on the Khmer Rouge?
Yeah, I'm Asian Studies minor as an undergraduate, and I did a travel study program through Asia my senior year. But when I came back from that and graduated, I worked for 2 years in a refugee resettlement program in Washington State and met Vietnamese, Cambodian, Lao people. It was the early 1980s, and large numbers of people were coming then. And I volunteered to teach English to 3 Cambodian sisters. And they started teaching me a little bit of Khmer. And so that was really how I first came to focus on to get to know Cambodians. And then I went back to school and did my master's and PhD in anthropology at Cornell. And at the time, there were only 2 places in the United States that you could study Cambodian language, Cornell and Hawaii. And I was fortunate enough to get accepted at Cornell. So I did my PhD there, did research with Cambodian refugees in the United States. You couldn't go to Cambodia then. Focused on gender roles, women in Cambodian literature. And then when I graduated in 89, I finished in August of 89, and the Vietnamese withdrew from Cambodia in September of 89. So I went sort of as soon as an American could go and lived there from 89 to 93. Really was doing work on, still primarily interested in gender, but instead of the sort of ideals about literature and so on, it was really applied, sort of how were women living their daily lives. And then that brought me to, this, everything in Cambodian society is affected by being in the aftermath of the Khmer Rouge time. So,
yeah, I couldn't help but notice that looking at right around the time that you graduated was really right around the time that people were flooding out of Cambodia and into America and the U.S. Kind of going back, you mentioned you worked at a resettlement camp that was in the States?
Not a resettlement camp, a refugee resettlement program. It was an office of USCC, United States Catholic Conference, and they were resettling large numbers of Cambodian, Vietnamese, and Lao in Washington State, and I worked for that program. A variety of different jobs there, helping people find jobs, meeting new arrivals at the airport, helping people do things like get kids enrolled in schools.
Right. And how old were you at the time, Judy, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, gosh, 21? Long time ago.
No, but, I think the reason why I ask is because I definitely was not working in that kind of capacity and that kind of environment at 21. I think it's very rare to find a lot of 21-year-olds to be in a position where you are like, I see what's going on and I want to help and I want to work here. So, I mean, what drew you to helping the situation that was at hand and really wanting to lean in to learn more about the Cambodian people?
So I think I said I did that travel study program when I was an undergraduate my senior year. And every place I went, it was 9 countries in 9 months. This is the Pacific Rim program at the University of Puget Sound. So you'd get to a country and you knew nothing. and then we lived with a family, we took a class, and it took a while for you to learn the most basic things like how to say please and thank you and how to find your way around a city and how to, And so when I graduated and I was unemployed and sleeping on my brother's couch and trying to figure out what to do with my life, I started volunteering at this refugee office. And I was helping these people who were just landing in a place and who had that same sort of being lost in the moment. They didn't know anything or where anything was or how to. And then once I volunteered with the office for some time, then they hired me. But I started out volunteering. My boss in that job was an anthropologist. Everybody else was looking at these new arrivals and going, oh, these poor people, this is so sad. We need to help, which is true enough and a good instinct, absolutely. But she was also, as an anthropologist, saying, oh my gosh, how much can we learn from these people? How much do these people have to teach us? Which was not the common response. And I think that that's part of what led me towards anthropology and towards a focus on Cambodia.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember a specific story that was shared with you from a Cambodian refugee or a specific moment during that time period that made you think, oh my gosh, this is what I have to study?
Well, as your podcast dramatically demonstrates, every Cambodian story is overwhelming, is so powerful that if you just listen to people tell the stories of their lives, the Khmer Rouge stories, but also the stories of escape, stories of life in the refugee camp. From that time period, I remember a woman telling me the story of escaping to the refugee camps and then being bused by the Thai military up to Previhia and then forced down the escarpment at Previhia at gunpoint, through a minefield and people blowing up and, her family surviving that and then escaping a second time and getting back to the border again. And it's just, sort of astonishing what people had lived through.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that because I had only learned about Prefir and the horrors that happened there just recently, only a few years ago, from my father. And this was after us recording his own story. He luckily was able to escape Prefir only because he got on the bus prior, like the next bus that was leaving was going to go to Prefir. And it was very just by luck that he didn't end up in that horrible place. And I think it's just a forgotten part of the story. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that because how horrific, what a horrible time, what a horrible image to even think about being forced on top of a mountain. So, I think it just goes to show that there's so many stories that have yet to be shared. And a lot of it is not shared enough. We don't have enough, I think, platforms that kind of highlight the Khmer Rouge, in my opinion, even in history books. I grew up not knowing about my own history unless I sat my own father down and really started interviewing him. So, in your opinion, what do you think makes the Khmer Rouge so different from other genocides? Because I know that you kind of got that exposure working in that volunteering site and actually having one-on-one time with these refugees. But what is your opinion on what makes the Khmer Rouge overall so different from other genocides?
In terms of loss of life as percentage of the population, it's the worst of the 20th century. It's somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 Cambodians, depending on, we don't have clear population statistics exactly from the beginning, from the 1970s, but 2 million people out of a pre-war population of between 7 and 8 million people. So that in and of itself is astonishing. And then the scale of it across the country, it varied from place to place, the way things that played out, but almost every Cambodian family is scarred by the loss of at least one immediate family member, but often many immediate family members. And so there are only I guess Croce was one of the few places in the country where there was less death. And then the evacuation of the cities was so radical. Many of the most basic policies, getting rid of markets, getting rid of religion, getting rid of political systems, the separation of families, all of those are deliberate attempts to destroy the pre-war society. And it went on for almost 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah. You do a whole study on this. In 1990, you graduated from Cornell and you spent 1990 to 1996 in Cambodia to do research and kind of study the aftermaths of the Khmer Rouge, which you co-authored with May Ebahara. Tell me a little bit about this experience.
I lived there from 89 to 91. I was doing a project for Cornell University Libraries, but I also then did some postdoctoral research, and I taught at the Royal University of Fine Arts. The research I did with May Bahara was 1990, 1991, 1994, 1996. And we went back to the village where she had done her doctoral dissertation research in 1959-60. When she was a graduate student at Columbia University, she went and did research for a year. And for many, many years, of course, she had no idea what had happened to the people that she knew. And then when she was finally able to go back for a brief visit, she was able to find out that in fact, people had survived from the place where she had done the research before. So I worked as her research assistant to go back and do interviews with people about what had happened to them during, after she left. So the Lon Nol time, the Khmer Rouge time, and then how they had rebuilt their lives in the 1980s and 90s.
Mm-hmm. And her studies in the 50s and 60s, what was that about? I'm sure post-Khmer Rouge was definitely focused on the Khmer Rouge, but 50s and 60s, obviously she wouldn't have known to study the Khmer Rouge because it didn't happen yet.
No, it was a classic ethnographic study. So she lived in the village for a year. She looked at agriculture, kept track of people's the cycle of agriculture, the cycle of daily life, ritual activity, social organization, kinship. She made note cards of all the different families and all the different people in the families and who intermarried with whom. She kept track of where people traveled because she was interested in the connections between the village and the city. That was how anthropology was done in those days. You sort of did a description of daily life from the ground level. Those cards, in fact, these kinship cards with everybody become very useful in the research later because she pulls out those cards and as we're talking to people, she says, well, you had 6 children. What happened to this person? What happened to this person? What happened to this person? And then, we heard all those stories of what had happened to people in the intervening years.
Yeah. How many of those people survived?
So when she left, there were about 150 people or so, and then some of them died of natural causes. So there were about 130 people, and of them about 70 survived. So the death rate was almost half in that area. So it's higher than many other places in Cambodia. And in my subsequent research, I'm doing research now, kept doing research in that village after May stopped going, and May passed away in 2005, and I've continued to go since then, 2010, 2013, 2018, and then most recently in 2022. I think that I've come to the conclusion that the reason that the death rate was so high was because it was a battlefield in the Lon Nol time, and it was heavily, heavily bombed. American bombing, Lon Nol bombing, landmines, unexploded ordnance of multiple kinds, because the Khmer Rouge were coming up from the south, and the Lon Nol forces were defending the city, pushing southward, to fight them. So the people had fled from Svai into Phnom Penh after 1972, and when the Khmer Rouge took Phnom Penh and emptied the city, they were pushed out. They were classified as new people. So these, the despised of the regime, even though they had been farmers. When they get back to that area, everything's destroyed. Everything had been destroyed in the fighting. And instead of, in many places in the country, when they were forced out of the cities, they joined regular villages, and the local villagers helped to support them. But when they got back to Svai, there was nothing there. And then many people died stepping on ordnance in those early, 11 of those 70 people who died, 11 of them died in the first year from starvation and landmines or ordnance of some kind.
It's fascinating that an area that she studied unknowingly would become the land in which the Khmer Rouge would have so much activity, and having those cards that she had from studying prior only were that much more meaningful post Khmer Rouge, because then you can really have something to compare it to. Not that that was her intention. Obviously, she didn't know that that was going to happen, but what a useful surprise, I guess, being able to have those to look back on and do a comparison.
Her dissertation finally got turned into a book in 2018. So there's her book, which I wrote a chapter, an introductory chapter, which talks about the importance of the book for everybody who studies the country afterwards, because it was the only one of only two pre-war village studies. The other one is in French by Gabrielle Martel. And then the new thing, the exciting thing, is that it has just been translated into Khmer.
Oh, wonderful.
The Center for Khmer Studies, it just came out last month, and I just got my copy this week.
Oh, my gosh.
It'll be great because people there can read it.
Right. So this post-Khmer Rouge study that you went to Cambodia to help her really learn the post-effects post-Khmer Rouge, because yes, the Khmer Rouge happened 4 years. The different facets of society that the Khmer Rouge has touched within the 4 years were catastrophic. And I think even myself, as a second-generation Cambodian American, a lot of the times, many of us are living with it. We have parents who are so close to it. We are dealing with our own intergenerational trauma. But I don't think we've ever been taught from a third-party perspective, from the outside perspective, exactly what facets the Khmer Rouge touched and destroyed, I guess you can say. In this study that you did with May, I thought it was a wonderful consolidation of exactly the different points that were affected in society post Khmer Rouge. So I was hoping to kind of go through them. You talked about mortality, family reconstructions, gender imbalance, revival of Buddhism, and uncertainty, fear, and violence. So I wanted to kind of go through those briefly, one by one, through the points. I think it'd be super valuable for the listeners to hear. So the first thing that you touched upon is mortality. What is it that you learned about the Khmer Rouge effect on mortality? I know you've already mentioned it, and it should already be pretty obvious, but what did you learn from the study on mortality?
Well, people just, more men died than women, partly because they were more likely to be executed for assumed connections to the previous government or what their roles had been before. That's one issue. The other is that educated people and people who had jobs with the old regime were more likely to be targeted. They were also more likely to have fled after. So there were specific segments of the population, educated people in particular. After, when people, and then people get moved around. They get sent to other parts of the country. And in certain areas of the country where they go, like people who were sent up to Posat, people who were sent up to Battambang have much higher death rates than some other areas. So when the Khmer Rouge fall, everyone moves around the country trying to go back home. And it's really in 79 and into 1980 that people reconstitute their lives, and they made households with the people who were left. So sometimes it would be a household where there'd be a couple and a couple of unmarried sisters from his side or her side, and then a couple of orphaned kids from a sibling whose both parents had died. And so they rebuilt households, extended households from the fragments of the pre-war families.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So mortality, then, I think that kind of blends into the point of gender imbalance. You had mentioned that the male people were targeted more so, leaving a lot of widows. You kind of mentioned that in your third point in the paper. What were kind of the socio-economical effects of having more women to men, and how does that affect the economy of Cambodia post-Khmer Rouge?
Well, women did a lot of were forced to do a lot of jobs that they hadn't done before.
Mm-hmm.
There were certain areas where it said that women plowed or women did other kinds of agricultural labor that had previously just been the men. But in many areas, women who were women-headed households would have to hire labor, or they would have to do labor exchange where the man would plow their fields and then in turn they would go and help do transplanting in his fields for a certain period of time. And so this made women-headed households generally poorer. It wasn't just women-headed households. You also had to look at, did she have a son or did she have a nephew or but it was male labor in general, that women were in a more difficult position if they didn't have male labor. And then in the bureaucracy after the war, women occupied many lower and mid-level positions in the government bureaucracy because there just weren't enough men. That changes over time. Cambodia now has returned to basically back to 50-50 after all these years, a whole new generation or generation and a half. But for a long time, women were, and women, of course, always had been active in the marketplace. This is one of the characteristics of Cambodian society, that women run small-scale selling and handle money. But for them to step into the government bureaucracy was a change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then this changes again after the war is over and the country opens after 93 with garment factories and women in very large numbers going to work in the garment factories and living on their own in the cities often, where they would have been before the revolution. They would have been kept very close to home. And so there's much more mobility and women having their own earning power after 93.
Yeah. I know that Cambodia is a pretty traditional country in terms of gender roles. And I had just recently learned about the Chap Sre, which is a book of rules for women. I don't know if you've heard of this, Judy.
Yeah, I have a chapter in my dissertation on the Chabat Sre.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually had previously had Emily who went to Cambodia, and she had taught some of these girls how to zine, like magazine. And she talked about, kind of referenced the Chap Sre and how that is an empowering thing to teach Cambodian girls how to zine and kind of use their voice to create and essentially create their own little books. And so through that conversation, I had learned about the Chap Sre, and being a woman myself, a Cambodian American, I've always been curious on how the Chap Sre really influenced women in Cambodia, and especially post Khmer Rouge, how that might have been the opposite of maybe how they grew up, of being put in these more quote unquote man-gendered roles. I wondered if that was a struggle to them. I can assume yes, but how maybe that would have influenced their kind of thinking post Khmer Rouge.
Yeah, the Chabat Sre is really interesting. I mean, it's a didactic codes for women. You'll rise before your husband and prepare everything for him. You'll go to bed. You do all the work and you go to bed after him. You won't so much as pick a louse from his head without first bowing down before him. It's Cambodians a generation ago, or your grandmother's generation, I guess, would have learned to chant it. It was memorized and chanted. It was taught in the public schools in the 50s. So when I was doing the research for my dissertation with Cambodians in the United States, and these were people who had just arrived in the United States, and they were really trying to hold on to Cambodian culture. And they would say, oh, yes, the Chabat Sre is really great. It's really wonderful. It's part of our heritage. But if you started to dig down and ask people about it, some women would say, oh, my gosh, I can't do that in America. I can't.
We're in a new land now.
Yes, far too restrictive. But there's some research has been done in Cambodia about the Chabat, because in Cambodia too, there was a push we need to hang on to our culture. We need to hang on to our things, the way things were before, including these ideals about women. In reality, gender roles were in fact changing in the workplace, but also women had greater mobility, women had greater earning power, women dress less conservatively. I taught field schools in Cambodia for years. I took American students, and these were was done with the Royal University of Fine Arts. And so Cambodian students and American students together going out to do research in the countryside on the reestablishment of Buddhism. And I would give these lectures to the American students before they went. You can't wear short shorts. You have to wear things that cover your shoulders. You have to be conservative. Cambodia is a conservative society for women. And over the years I was doing it, by the time we got into the 2000s, they would say, look at the little mini skirts and short shorts. You're telling us that this is a conservative society, but this is not what we're seeing.
Yeah. Times are changing for Cambodia, at least, just from what I've heard and what I've seen from my father, who had visited. He probably goes twice a year at this point. The few other points that you had mentioned, kind of going back to the paper. So we've talked a little bit about gender imbalance, talked about mortality, family reconstructions, and social networks. I know you kind of mentioned in the paper, in the research, that most people who had lost their lives in the Khmer Rouge then had to kind of come and piece their families back together with whoever was remaining. And then also this kind of leaning more on friends versus a trust in the government, because that had been kind of destroyed from the Khmer Rouge times. Can you talk a little bit just about what you had learned in regards to family reconstructions?
The village where I did research is really interesting because it's a place where people who lived there before, even if they got scattered, they came back there. And there very few outsiders came. And so it was people who knew each other before. They were all interrelated by marriage over time. So there's something bong on, they were all bong on. They were all relatives of some sort. They might not be able to tell you exactly how, we're second cousins or fourth cousins or whatever, but they did things like labor exchange, like helping to plow each other's fields and plant each other's fields. And they loaned each other small amounts of money or small amounts of rice when somebody was in trouble. There was a whole literature about Cambodia in the 80s and 90s about how, society was completely destroyed and nobody helped each other anymore. There was a book that was published called Every Household is an Island, that Cambodian society was destroyed and wasn't being reconstructed. And so Mayabhar and I wrote that article in part to argue against that idea, that no, we see that these family connections and friendships are being reconstructed. Well, now in hindsight, now many years later, I've read ethnographies research by other anthropologists who did research in other areas of Cambodia. And I know that in some ways Svai is unusual, that in some other parts of the country, the people who came back to that place, it might have been some people who lived there before, but some of them might have been returnees from the camp. Some of them might have been, former Khmer Rouge who came back. Some of them in places where Yves Zucker's book that's on a mountainside, and there's people who went up the mountain and joined the Khmer Rouge, and people who went down the mountain and fought on the other side, and then they come back together to live. And so there are places that are much more conflicted and had much more trouble reestablishing those kinds of social networks afterwards than the area where we did research. So there's a lot of variation around the country and how that all played out.
I remember kind of reading that part of the research and thinking, I don't know if you had heard or come along in your studies, but currently the discussion within second generation Cambodian Americans, at least, is that our previous generation who had survived the Khmer Rouge, meaning our parents, had come out of the Khmer Rouge not trusting anyone. In fact, we reference a thing called crabs in a bucket mentality. And essentially what that is that we say as the second generation that the previous generation are not very supportive of each other. Every time somebody tries to does successful or does well or is about to find their way out of the bucket, another person will pull them down. And it's kind of a very active discussion within the second generation, within my generation, that we look back at our parents and are like, why is it that they can't seem to support one another in the same way that you can see, Chinese people with like Chinatowns and Vietnamese people and Koreans with their Koreatowns and et cetera. it's always been this discussion around lack of pride within the country and the culture because of maybe the shame that came along post Khmer Rouge. I don't know if that kind of resonates with some of your research and or if this is something new, but kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that.
The people who are in the United States, people who are resettled in other countries, have the added guilt. You have survivor's guilt that you survived it, then the added guilt that you got out and escaped and didn't have to survive another, decade of civil war and landmines and the things that people and then those social networks that got rebuilt to some degree within the country when people came back together. Of course, most people didn't have that. Maybe they were able to reunite with some relatives abroad, but oftentimes, no, they're rebuilding communities with people that they didn't know before. And so it might be a controversial thing to say in some ways, that in some ways the people who left, you think, oh, they escaped and got to the United States and sort of were saved. But in fact, in some ways, it's a more difficult time than people who stayed within the country, because they had to rebuild everything about their lives, from learning a new language to new ways to earn living and the struggle. I worked on a crab boat in Alaska for a while, so I have this image of the crabs in my mind now. That's
yeah. And I'm sure, of course, it varies between people who had stayed in Cambodia versus people who had got out, whether it be in America, France, or Australia, and any other of the Western countries that took on refugees.
Well, in the Cambodian communities in the United States, or around the world, were very divided in the early years by politics, right? Who did you support? Were you a royalist, or were you KPNLF, or were you someone who didn't want to deal with politics of the home country? And that was reflected in all sorts of social organizations in the U.S. There were associations that were formed, and even Buddhist temples. Cities would have 2 temples, and that were associated with different political parties. And so those kinds of divisions split people for a long time too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Would you argue then that maybe people who had gotten out to these Western countries experienced a little bit more division versus the ones that stayed in Cambodia?
Yes, I think so. People who were in Cambodia, there was a lot of repression during the 80s, the Vietnamese army occupation, but also the Cambodian government kept pretty tight control over everything. So there wasn't any room for people to voice much opposition. If they were opposed to the government, they could try to get to the border and get out. But inside, there wasn't a lot that they could say or do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned temples that, as an example, in one city, they would build 2 different temples. Another point within your research was revival of Buddhism, kind of the resurgence of religion. Can you talk a little bit about how the Khmer Rouge affected that?
Well, the Khmer Rouge, as you know, destroyed religion, not just Buddhism, also Christianity and Islam, the minority religions. They destroyed mosques and churches, and they destroyed Buddhist temples, Buddhism being the religion of about 90% of the population. And it varied around the country, but on the Central Plains, where I was doing my research, they destroyed most of the temples. Sometimes they attached explosives to them and blew them up. Sometimes they just destroyed all the images and the paintings and the scriptures and so on, and then used the empty buildings for other purposes, including jails. They made all the monks disrobe and leave the monkhood. They prohibited ritual activity and life cycle rituals, which is particularly devastating for people at a time when there was so much death that they couldn't do funerals or other kinds of ritual for the dead.
Right.
So in the 1980s, the government allowed Buddhism, but kept it very tightly restricted. Only men over 50 could ordain as monks, although that was broken in some rural areas. But they didn't allow all the temples to be reopened. But after 93, when the country opens up, and after Cambodian Americans and other Cambodians abroad could send money back and began to send money back, and then as people gathered money, got more money in the cities too, and sent money back to their home villages, then there's money to begin to rebuild these rural temples. Mm-hmm. And there's an explosion of that in the 1990s. Temples are being rebuilt all over the place. And besides ordaining as a monk, rebuilding a temple, participating in the dedication of a rebuilt temple is one of the most auspicious things that you can do. And Cambodians from abroad wanted to come back and do prayers for the people who had died during the Khmer Rouge time, to build chedi, and even if they couldn't relocate the remains of their loved ones, to at least do Buddhist ritual and make merit that they can pass to them. This is what I did the field schools on. So we were documenting the rebuilding of the temples, men ordaining as monks again, reprinting scriptures, repainting the art, reestablishing the tradition.
Would you argue that there are probably more people leaning into religion and Buddhism post Khmer Rouge because of how devastating the Khmer Rouge was? Or do you think would you argue that yes, people returned because they never had a chance to kind of dedicate funerals to the people who are lost, but not as many returned? What would you say? In what way do you think it swung?
In the early years that they were able to rebuild people were so driven by it. I mean, you think of the level of poverty, the people were so poor, and yet any bit of extra money that they got, they would donate to the temple to help rebuild. So it was very important, and it was also a way for many individuals to deal with their suffering. So I know one woman who had lost her husband and all 5 of her children, who spent her later years learning Buddhist texts and going to the temple regularly and, devoting herself to earning merit. So on an individual basis, yes, absolutely. There were people who sought solace in Buddhism, and it was central to how they rebuilt their lives. I think over time it's changed, so that the biggest change being that young men don't ordain as monks anymore. That in their grandparents' generation, every man would ordain as a monk, at least for a 3-month period at the rainy season, 1 vusa. In fact, that's how many elders became literate, was, the time they spent as a monk. They'd stay in for 1 year or 2 years and then leave the monkhood. But nowadays, very few men ordain. They might ordain as young novices in order to help get an education, mm-hmm. and then they'll leave after they go up through the monk education system, or they'll ordain for 3 days or a week at the death of a parent or another relative, sort of as a symbolic gesture. It's not the same as the time that their grandparents would have spent, where they really would have learned a lot of Buddhist teaching and chanting and so on.
Right. It's going to take time, I could only imagine. And even then, after something as devastating as the Khmer Rouge, it's hard for people to return to it in the same way. Or if they return, they're returning to it maybe for other reasons, such as community and a way of healing, as you mentioned. The last point you kind of mentioned before we move on is this idea of uncertainty, fear, and violence. Kind of after leaving the Khmer Rouge or having the Khmer Rouge leave them, I guess you can say, lack of personal safety, increase of domestic violence that you would see in households, generational trauma, as we can all expect after surviving something as horrific as that. In what ways in the research have you seen those things be heightened post-Khmer Rouge?
That people live with a constant level of uncertainty and fear. So in the literature on the Holocaust, there's a phrase that someone used about the idea that it can't happen to me is gone. Because it did. It did happen to you. And right. So you always think about the worst, what's the worst possible outcome that could happen in this situation, and that's what you think might happen. So that affects everything you do, planning new projects to being worried about, parents who are constantly terrified when their children go away from them, and check up on them constantly, because they're terrified of. I remember in 93 at the time of the UN elections, there were women who I was doing, one of the projects I did was on birth control, and there were women who had IUDs. And before the election, they went in and had them taken out. because if the elections went badly and the whole society collapsed and the healthcare system collapsed, they wanted to be able to have children again if they lost some of their children.
Oh, wow.
Just, at that level, what would happen if society completely collapsed? You have to think ahead about that.
Yeah, and I think exactly what you're talking to is this idea of constant survival mode, right? Like post Khmer Rouge, and something that a lot of my generation also kind of discusses, how maybe we believe some of that kind of survival mode has been transferred to us in some ways because it's so close to us. Our parents still, in a lot of ways, treat the world and see the world through a lens of, oh, but they can come back, or the world can collapse, because it did unexpectedly, that when they didn't think that it would, but it did. Kind of this constant fear, ruminating fear in the back of all the survivors' heads that, like, something can come back.
This is part of why the work that you do is so important, is that I think you talked about how it was so important for your father to tell his story in the podcast, but I think there are many survivors who have still not told their stories. And, for some of them now, they're elders and time is running short. And so to help with collecting those stories is really important.
I agree. I didn't realize the healing power of storytelling until I sat my father down and did this podcast, where after we finished recording, he actually turned over to me and said, I stopped having nightmares about a month ago. And I think,
wow.
Yeah. And I think, we've started several programs outside of that because I've wanted to try to recreate this storytelling capsule for other survivors. I have a videographer. As long as you fly to the Bay Area, which is where we're based, we will cover all the videographer costs and post it as a podcast episode. So it's a running program that I'm trying to push as well to capture as many stories as possible. I know that you have done your part, definitely, being part of the project in Chicago as part of the National Cambodian Heritage Museum. It is a project where you interviewed 50 Cambodian American elders in Chicago. Is that right, Judy?
And well, it was a project. So it was some American students who were my students at Northern Illinois University, and then some Cambodian Americans who were selected by the museum, the National Cambodian Heritage Museum and Killing Fields Memorial, long name. We did audio interviews with 50 Cambodian elders, and then we went back and did videos and focused in on 6. And then it took a long period of time. I should also say that had funding from the Henry Luce Foundation, for which we are most grateful. So the interviews were transcribed and translated. And then I taught a class that did an analysis, life history interview analysis, and then pulled out the important themes across them, and then worked with a exhibit designer. And then the museum, they commissioned this exhibit on the Khmer Rouge time, which is still up. It's been more than 15 years and it's still up at the museum today. They decided to keep it as a permanent exhibit. So it's the only museum of its kind in the United States that tells the story of the Khmer Rouge time, and then there's this memorial to those who were lost.
Was this something that you knew you always wanted to do, or how did it come to be that you were one of the head people to put this together?
Well, I was on the board of the museum. We did a couple of earlier exhibits. They had done the first exhibit that the museum did after it was set up in 2004 was on Cambodians coming to the United States, so about their arrival in Chicago. But I worked with them on 2 previous exhibits. One was called Khmer Spirit, which was about the arts, and sculpture and painting and so on. And the second was called Cambodia Born Anew, which is about the society reestablishing itself after. And those were both, they were at the Anthropology Museum at NIU, and they were at the museum in Chicago, and then after a time they switched. So both of those exhibits were in both places. So the idea for doing the Killing Fields Memorial actually came from the association. So it's the National Cambodian Heritage Museum, but it's under the Cambodian Association of Illinois. The museum is a separate 501c3, but the idea for the museum and the idea for this came from the Cambodian Association of Illinois. So for many years it was Gompa Set was the director, but the director of the museum today is Paul Chorm. And he was on the board way back in those early days too.
My father and I are going to Chicago this November, and I believe the Cambodian Association, if I'm remembering correctly, is the one you're referring to, has have their annual New Year's party, which is in November. So we're going to be attending that. No, I definitely want to see if I can scrape some time. I'm sure there will be time for us to maybe just swing by and visit.
Oh, you have to visit the museum. Absolutely.
Yeah. We've referenced it several times in our social media posts because a lot of people message me about, hey, where can we find history of Cambodia and specifically the Khmer Rouge in the US? And quite honestly, it's hard to find. I think Chicago really is the only one that's standing. I mean, I know that the Met in New York had a section dedicated to Cambodia, but it wasn't necessarily the Khmer Rouge. It was more like sculptures and stuff like that. But
some of which they've now returned.
yes, which are no longer there because I think they went back to Cambodia. But
when Maya Bahara passed, she gave her books to me. I had copies of many of them, so many of her books went to the library at the museum there. So they have besides having the archived interviews, they have a pretty good collection of books about Cambodia and about the Khmer Rouge time. So besides but the memorial is nice because people can, it's columns, glass columns with people's names etched on them, and you can have your lost loved ones' names added to those columns. So there are many Cambodians who have done that over the years, and they go to the museum in Chicago as a sort of pilgrimage to see their relatives' names.
Wow.
That's
amazing.
Very moving experience.
Yeah.
They also do a memorial in April each year.
Yeah, for remembrance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, you've spent almost your entire career studying and teaching the Khmer Rouge. Why do you think it is so important to teach the Khmer Rouge?
Well, the obvious thing that is you have to know about history in order to not repeat it. But I think that Americans are just woefully ignorant. I teach a general Southeast Asia class, NIU does every semester, and I give a lecture in that class on the Khmer Rouge every semester for years and years. And there's probably 50 to 100 kids in that class. And I'll ask at the end, the room just goes silent as I go on, as I explain. And at the end, I will ask how many of them knew that happened. And very few people, one or two people will raise their hand. Maybe they saw the movie The Killing Fields, or maybe they saw one of Ritti Pang's movies in later years. But in general, people just don't know. So that's the American people need to know. But then I think that Cambodian Americans, the importance of, over the years I've made it a point to teach and mentor both some Cambodian American students and also Cambodian students from Cambodia who've kind of come and done master's degrees or PhD at NIU and then gone back, either working with me in anthropology or working with my husband in political science, and then go back to Cambodia, or Cambodian Americans who've done degrees, and some of them have then gone and lived in Cambodia, and some of them have continued with work in the United States. But the idea of building the skills of that next generation, then they're the ones that are going to go and teach not just about the Khmer Rouge, but about, Cambodian in general. And so that's been a driving force over the years.
Right. Mm-hmm. You've taught so many groups of students that have come through your classroom who had never heard about the Khmer Rouge before, as you just mentioned. What would you say is the biggest misconception about the Khmer Rouge out there from these students?
I don't know if it's misconception. I think they just don't know anything. From the ones who do, I guess the problem is that people think that Cambodia freezes at that time, and that they don't know the story of how people then turned around and rebuilt their lives. I'm working on a book now on Twy that looks at the years since and how people through the the PRK and the dire poverty of the 1980s under the Vietnamese, and then, rebuilding in the 90s once the country reopens. How did people think of Cambodia? They either think of Angkor Wat and the sort of ancient glories, or they think of the Khmer Rouge, and then everything is just still dead and desperate and there. And that's not the case either. Cambodia people have rebuilt their lives, and Cambodian society has moved forward. And so I would say if people have the opportunity Cambodian Americans have the opportunity to go, they should go. Some people, like your father, you said, go regularly. But I think there's many people who still haven't gone back or are afraid to, some of them.
I think you're exactly right in that. I would even argue that even today, Cambodia is still trying to crawl themselves out of the Khmer Rouge times and the everything that it has affected and touched, and it's still in the healing process of trying to get out of what had happened. There is hope, as you mentioned, and you said that you were studying and working. Are you currently working on the project or currently working on the research?
I was an administrator. I was a professor for a long time, but in the last years of my career, I was moved and was an administrator, and so I didn't publish very much. So now that I'm retired, just as of 2 months ago, I have time to go back to writing, and so I'm working on a book about the village where Maya Bahar did her research, but in those intervening years and bringing it up until today. So,
And from your research, what hope do you see for Cambodians and Cambodia moving forward post Khmer Rouge?
Economically, the changes have just been dramatic, right? So Cambodia is now had like a 48% dire poverty rate, and now it's something like 10%. So people's lives have gotten better. When I first went, everyone walked, and you were lucky if you had a bicycle. And then it went to everyone has bicycles, and people have motorbikes, and now people have cars. And so certainly not everyone. Phnom Penh is much richer than remote rural areas, but life has improved for people almost everywhere. There's electricity now reaching into areas of the countryside, and healthcare is finally, the maternal mortality rate is finally down, and infant mortality rate is finally down. And there's so many things that the rest of the world takes for granted. Cambodia has really improved in the last 10 years. But with it has come rising inequality, and so that wealth is spread. There's people who are very, very rich and a lot of people who are very poor. But one of the things that gives me hope is education, that the education system is much improved, and it's both men and women. When I first started going there, as you went up the education ladder, it was more and more boys, right? So that by the time you got to university, it was all boys. And that's not the case anymore. Now it's 50% pretty much up, at least through high school. And so there, even people from the village where I do research are not wealthy, but even some of them have sent their kids to university, and now they're getting jobs in offices instead of agriculture. I think there's more opportunity for young people. Everyone knows about the world. Everyone's on Facebook, and yeah, I won't get into the politics of, there are limitations in the current politics too, but if you're just looking at economics and standard of living, I think things are much improved.
Yeah. I think the work that you do is really, really important, because people like me, who is a direct descendant from Cambodia and Khmer Rouge survivors, who grew up not even having a small paragraph of it in our own history books. Granted, I think there was a law passed, and I'm here in California, that some districts must start teaching about the Khmer Rouge after 2025, which I'm super, super excited about. But all in all, when I was growing up in middle school and high school, there was a whole bunch about the Vietnam War, but there was barely 2 sentences about the Khmer Rouge. And I always found it so fascinating that something that not only was I a direct descendant from, but something that really only happened in like the 70s and 80s, which is really not that long ago, would just be not existent in a lot of these history books, from middle school and high school. Granted, in university, if you study it in Asian American studies, I'm sure there'll be more room for it. But I still think it's super important to have anthropologists and historians out there who are teaching people about what had happened. I mean, we look at the state of the world today, and some people, as you mentioned, in America, were just so many of us are just so ignorant to what the world can be. Some people even refusing to believe that maybe something like a genocide could even exist. Your work that you have dedicated your life to continue teaching about the Khmer Rouge, I can only be, I'm just so grateful that you had done the work that you've done and was so passionate to continue educating the people who don't know.
Well, the Cambodian Association in Chicago was instrumental in getting legislation passed at the legislature in Illinois that to teach genocide studies, including a section on the Khmer Rouge. And then they were instrumental during COVID in allying with other Asian American groups to get a mandate to teach Asian American history in schools in Illinois too. So hopefully those will help with if other states are picking that up and that mandate to teach more Asian American studies.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Judy, Professor Judy, for coming on here and sharing your insight. You've done so much research that I mean, it would take a 10-hour podcast to really go through each one of these things that you have written. Is there anything else that you think is absolutely instrumental to point out, whether it be from another research paper that you have done that you think would be really educational for our listeners?
Yeah, I haven't. As I said, I haven't done a lot lately. The most recent thing I did was there's a new book about dual slang, which is published by Brill. It's called Dual Slang Genocide Museum, and it's about new research, and it's sort of reevaluating old research. But I wrote the preface. I say there that it's still important to do research about it, and that it's understandable why dual slang is such a touchstone, not only for Cambodians in Cambodia, but also for Cambodians abroad, to try to understand about the period, that because it's a site for memory and it's a site where the horrors of that time are the central focus, but that still resonates with people, like your dad, who are still telling his story, or until recently were still having those nightmares, that it becomes almost a pilgrimage place for people to go and try to understand what happened. So I would recommend that new book. That's just out in 2024.
Right. And for the rest of our listeners who want to find some of your work, Judy, where can they find you? I know that you're recently retired.
Yeah, and I was distraught to see that as soon as I retired, the anthropology department at NIU took me off their website, because there used to be links to a whole bunch of my articles right there. But you can search me in databases for some of my email is judyledgerwood@gmail.com. If people want to ask me for a particular piece, sometimes you'll find something and it's either out of print, or you don't have access because your university or library or whatever doesn't have that particular. So people could ask me. I don't have a single place where it's up anymore.
Well, I know that you had sent me some links in preparation of this podcast, so I will definitely use some of those links and post, if possible, post it in our show notes so that people can kind of look back and reference. Well, Judy, thank you so much for coming on here on the podcast. I really do believe that our listeners will get so much value out of listening to kind of the bird's eye view of exactly what the Khmer Rouge had affected, whether it be mortality, family reconstructions, revival of Buddhism, kind of this survival state that a lot of the people are still in. I just know that people will be getting a lot of value out of this discussion. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to have been invited.